The ranch had gone silent before Wade even opened his eyes. No hum of power, no distant engines, only the steady, hollow clang of metal echoing across the dark pasture. Out there, beyond the fence he stopped crossing years ago, his old horse was striking the gate, in a rhythm he had once known by heart. The morning light came slow over the Oregon hills, spreading pale gold across frost-stiff grass that hadn't felt a horse's weight in a long time. Wade Hollister stood beside his truck, one hand resting on the door, watching the pasture without really seeing it. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound breaking the quiet. He used to cross that field every day. Now he drove past it. The truck had made things easier. Faster checks, fewer hours in the saddle, less strain on a body that no longer forgave mistakes. Gates opened with switches. Water lines ran where they needed to. Cattle moved in patterns that didn't require a rider watching every turn. It was all efficient, clean, predictable, and far away from the habits he once knew by heart. A shape stood near the far fence, just beyond the line where the pasture dipped into a shallow hollow. Wade's eyes passed over it at first, the way a man looks at something he's already decided not to notice. But the shape didn't move. It never did. Juniper had been moved out there 3 winters ago when her gait began to stiffen and her steps lost their rhythm. She still ate, still drank. Louise checked her hooves, kept her feed steady. There was no cruelty in it, no neglect anyone could point to. Just distance. Wade reached into the truck and pulled out a pair of gloves, working them over his hands with slow, practiced movements. He could feel the cold pushing through the leather anyway. It always did now. Behind him, the ranch stretched out in quiet order, fences drawn straight, barns sealed tight against the wind, everything in its place. It had taken years to build it that way. Years of early mornings, broken tools, long rides across land that didn't forgive hesitation. Back then, he hadn't been alone. Juniper had been a young mare when he first brought her in. Not fast, not particularly strong, but steady. The kind of horse that didn't panic when the weather turned or the cattle scattered. She learned the land the way a person might, through repetition, through patience, through being there when it mattered. He had trusted that for a long time. The wind shifted, carrying the dry scent of winter grass and something older beneath it. Dust, maybe, or the faint trace of animals that had passed through long before fences marked the ground. Wade leaned against the truck and followed the fence line with his eyes, letting them settle just for a moment on the far edge of the field. Juniper stood with her head lowered, her coat dulled by seasons that had worn through its shine. One ear turned slightly, not toward him, but toward the open space beyond. She wasn't watching the ranch. She was listening to something else, something the wind carried that Wade no longer tried to hear. Louise approached from the barn, boots crunching over the frozen dirt. "She's been pacing a little more these past few days," he said, nodding toward the far pasture. Wade didn't turn. Cold does that. Louise hesitated, then shifted his weight. Maybe she's looking for something. Wade let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh. "She's not looking for anything. She's just old." The words landed flat between them. Louise didn't argue. He rarely did. Instead, he adjusted his jacket and glanced once more toward Juniper before heading back toward the barn. The conversation ended the way most things did out here, without resolution, carried off by the wind. Wade pushed himself upright and climbed into the truck. The engine turned over with a low, steady growl, filling the silence that had settled too easily over the land. He drove along the fence line, tires pressing tracks into the frost, the pasture sliding past his window in long, familiar stretches. He didn't slow down. But as he reached the bend where the ground dipped, he found himself glancing out again. Juniper hadn't moved. For a brief second, no more than that, he considered stopping. The thought came uninvited, like a memory surfacing at the wrong time. He could walk out there, check the fence, maybe call her name. He didn't. The truck rolled on, carrying him forward, leaving the pasture behind like something already settled. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a dull, heavy gray, the kind that pressed low over the hills, promising a colder night than the last. Wade finished his rounds before dusk, securing what needed securing, checking what needed checking. Everything was in place, everything always was. As darkness settled, the ranch grew still again, the kind of stillness that made even small sounds carry farther than they should. Wade stepped inside his house, shutting the door against the cold, leaving the wind and the open land outside where they belonged. Out beyond the fence, Juniper lifted her head for the first time in hours. The air had changed. Somewhere in the distance, something shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible. Not a sound Wade would have noticed, not a signal any machine would catch. But it was enough. She turned slowly toward the ranch, her body aligning with something older than habit, something etched deep into muscle and memory. Then she began to move, not fast, not urgent, just purposeful, toward the gate. By the time Juniper reached the lower rail, the first hard edge of night had settled over Hollister Ranch. Inside the house, Wade sat alone at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm between his hands. The old farmhouse creaked around him the way it always did when the temperature dropped fast. Pipes settled in the walls, wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere beyond the glass, the land disappeared into a blackness wide enough to swallow every fence line. He had lived with those sounds for 40 years. They no longer made him look up. On the counter, the small radio muttered about a cold front moving down from the Blue Mountains. Wade heard just enough to know the night would be rough, then reached over and shut it off. Warnings came often in winter. Most of them passed without consequence. A rancher learned not to jump at every change in the sky. He carried his mug to the sink, rinsed it once, and left it there. Before heading upstairs, he paused near the back door. Through the narrow pane of glass, he could see the barn lights glowing in their usual places, one over the feed room, one near the old hay barn, another by the equipment shed. Small yellow points against the dark. Proof that everything still held together. Wade turned away. The lights went out before he reached the first step. Not flickering, not dimming. Gone. The house dropped into silence so complete it seemed to have weight. The refrigerator stopped humming. The heater died mid-breath. The familiar electric pulse of the ranch vanished all at once, leaving only the wind moving over the roof. Wade stood still in the dark. For a few seconds he listened with the patience of a man who had solved too many problems to fear the first sign of one. Power outages were nothing new. Lines iced over, transformers failed, breakers tripped. He kept a flashlight in the drawer, a generator in the shed, and enough stubbornness to outlast any inconvenience the weather brought. He found the flashlight by touch and clicked it on. A pale circle opened across the floor. "Damn cold night for this," he muttered. He pulled on his coat, stepped onto the porch, and felt the air bite straight through the fabric. The ranch lay before him in a dark, frozen hush. Without the barn lights, the outbuildings looked older than they were, their roofs black against a moonless sky. The wind moved low across the ground, carrying dry grass against fence posts in brittle whispers. Wade aimed the flashlight toward the generator shed. Nothing. No automatic kick, no low engine rumble, no vibration through the frozen earth. That made him frown. He went down the porch steps carefully, boots finding the hard-packed dirt. Each breath came out white. The beam of light bounced ahead of him as he crossed the yard, catching pieces of the ranch in fragments. Gate hinges, tire ruts, a coil of hose stiff with ice, the silver edge of a water trough. Then he heard it, a dull strike of metal. He stopped. The sound came again. Not loud, not frantic. A hollow clang from somewhere beyond the main yard. Wade turned his head toward the lower pasture. The wind carried the noise unevenly, breaking it apart before it reached him. For a moment he thought it was a loose chain hitting a gate. Maybe a latch swinging free, maybe one of Luis's tools left where it shouldn't have been. Another clang, then another, evenly spaced. Wade's jaw tightened. He swept the flashlight toward the pasture, but the beam died long before it reached the far fence. The dark beyond it remained whole. "Not tonight," he said under his breath. He took 3 steps toward the generator shed, then stopped again. The sound came once more. 3 strikes, a pause. 3 strikes again. Something in his chest tightened, not fear exactly. Recognition before understanding, the kind that arrives in the body before the mind is ready to name it. He turned away from the shed. The lower gate sat nearly 200 yards beyond the yard, half hidden near the slope where the old pasture dipped. Wade had not opened it himself in months. Luis used it when he needed to check Juniper. Wade had no reason to go that way anymore. Yet the sound kept coming from there. He walked slowly at first, more irritated than worried. The beam of his flashlight cut over the frozen grass. His boots slipped once on a patch of hard ground, and he caught himself against a fence post with a grunt. Age had made every small mistake feel personal. Halfway down the line, he saw her. Juniper stood at the gate. Her old bay coat was nearly black in the darkness, except where the flashlight found the rough curve of her shoulder and the pale vapor rising from her nostrils. She was not throwing herself against the fence. She was not panicked. She simply lifted one front hoof and struck the lower metal rail, once, twice, 3 times. Then she waited. Wade stopped where he was. Juniper! The name came out smaller than he expected. The mare did not toss her head. She did not whinny. One ear shifted toward him, acknowledging the sound, but her body stayed angled toward the ranch buildings behind him. Then she struck the rail again. 3 measured blows. Wade felt the cold more sharply then. Not on his skin, but somewhere deeper, under the ribs. He moved closer, raising the flashlight. Juniper's eyes caught the beam for a moment, clouded with age, dark beneath the brow, steady in a way that made him uncomfortable. "Easy, girl," he said, though she needed no calming. That was what bothered him. A frightened horse scattered its energy. It pulled, backed, pawed without rhythm. Juniper was doing none of that. She was repeating something. A signal. Wade looked toward the ranch buildings. The generator still had not started. The house stood black behind him. The barns were black too, their shapes almost invisible against the night. He told himself the problem was electrical. Simple. Mechanical. He should be at the shed, checking the breaker, not standing in the freezing dark watching an old horse tap a gate like a memory trying to get in. Juniper struck again. 3 times. A pause. The sound traveled through the rails, through the fence post, into Wade's gloved hand where it rested on the gate. And suddenly, without warning, he was not 70 years old anymore. He was standing in another winter, another storm, another dark night, when a young mare had learned that 3 strikes on metal brought a man running. His fingers tightened around the rail. "No," he whispered. But the past had already opened. Not fully, not kindly. Just enough for him to remember a night when Ellen had been trapped in the old foaling barn during a whiteout, when the phone lines were down, when Juniper had broken loose and hammered the gate until Wade woke from a dead sleep. 3 strikes. A pause. 3 strikes again. He had not thought about that rhythm in years. Maybe he had chosen not to. Juniper lowered her hoof and stood still. For the first time that night, Wade stopped treating the darkness as an inconvenience. He turned his flashlight toward the old hay barn beyond the equipment shed. It was barely visible from where he stood, a darker shape against the ridge line. The automatic latch system had been installed 2 years earlier, after Wade decided fewer manual checks meant fewer mistakes. But the rescue horses were in that wing tonight. Mara had asked him to keep them there until transport arrived in the morning. Wade had forgotten that detail. The realization moved through him like cold water. He stepped back from the gate, suddenly aware of the silence again, the missing generator, the dead lights, the locked barn, the falling temperature. Behind him, Juniper shifted her weight, old joints stiff but steady. She did not push through the gate. She did not follow. She only watched him. Wade started toward the barn. This time, he did not walk slowly. The ground hardened under his boots as he cut across the yard, the beam of his flashlight shaking just enough to betray the urgency he refused to name. The cold pressed tighter now, slipping through seams in his coat, settling into his joints. Wade moved faster anyway. The old hay barn sat beyond the equipment shed, half-shadowed even on clear nights. It had been refitted not long ago, metal latch system, automatic closure tied to the main power grid, efficient, reliable, until it wasn't. As he approached, the outline of the structure sharpened against the dark. No light leaked from the cracks. No movement inside, at least none that carried beyond the thick wooden walls. The silence there felt different, contained, as if something inside it was holding its breath. Wade reached the door and grabbed the handle. It didn't budge. He pulled harder. The latch held firm, locked in place without power to release it. The mechanism had been designed that way, to stay shut in case of failure. A safeguard, the installer had said, keeps things secure. Wade cursed under his breath. He circled the side, boots crunching over frozen dirt, searching for another entry. The smaller access door near the feed bins, he tried that too. Same resistance. The system had sealed everything tight. Inside, something shifted. A dull scrape, then another, not loud but enough. Wade pressed his ear briefly against the wood. The cold bit into his skin, but he stayed there long enough to catch it again. A restless movement, the sound of hooves adjusting on packed ground. Not panic, not yet, but not stillness either. He stepped back and lifted the flashlight toward the hinges, then down to the latch housing. Ice had begun to form along the edges, thin but stubborn. The metal wouldn't give without force. "Should have checked this," he muttered. The words came without anger, just fact. He set the flashlight on the ground, angling it up so the beam held steady on the door. Then he braced his shoulder against the wood and pushed. Nothing. He tried again, harder this time. The door groaned faintly, but held. Inside, the shifting grew more frequent. Wade stopped, breathing heavier now, the cold air cutting into his chest. He wasn't as strong as he used to be. That wasn't something he often admitted, not out loud, not even to himself, but the resistance in the door made it clear. He stepped back, forcing himself to think. The latch. It needed power, or it needed to be broken. He turned, scanning the ground, until he spotted a length of metal pipe leaning against the shed wall. He grabbed it, tested the weight in his hands, then moved back to the door. One strike. The sound rang out sharp against the night. He hit it again, aiming for the latch housing. The vibration traveled up his arms, jarring his shoulders. The metal dented slightly, but not enough. Inside, the horses reacted. This time the sound was unmistakable, hooves shifting faster, a body brushing against wood, the low, restrained tension of animals that didn't understand what was happening but felt the change in the air. Wade paused, listening. They weren't panicking yet. That mattered. "Hold steady," he said under his breath, though they couldn't hear him the way a rider hears a voice through reins and breath. Still, the words came. He lifted the pipe again. Strike, strike. The latch began to give, just a fraction. Wade adjusted his stance, ignoring the ache building in his arms. Each blow landed slower than the last, but more deliberate. He wasn't trying to overpower the mechanism anymore. He was working it, the way he used to work stubborn gates in winter, feeling for the weakness, the point where pressure mattered more than force. Another strike. The metal cracked. A small sound almost lost in the wind, but Wade felt it through the pipe more than he heard it. He dropped the tool and grabbed the handle again. This time, it shifted. Not much, but enough. He pulled harder, the muscles in his shoulders tightening, breath coming in sharp bursts. The latch resisted, then slipped just slightly out of alignment. Inside, one of the horses let out a low, uncertain call. Wade didn't stop. With a final pull, the door broke free, swinging inward just enough to open a narrow gap. Cold air rushed into the barn, carrying with it the scent of hay, dust, and the warm, living presence of animals that had been waiting in the dark. Wade stepped inside, lifting the flashlight. 3 horses stood clustered near the far wall, their shapes shifting in the beam. Rescue stock, thin in places, wary by habit, not yet settled into the routines of the ranch. Their eyes reflected the light, wide but not wild. They had been contained long enough to hold their ground. "Easy now," Wade said, voice low. He moved slowly, keeping the beam down, giving them space. The cold had crept into the barn as well, the air sharper than it should have been. A water trough near the corner had begun to ice over, the surface stiffening into a thin, fragile sheet. Another few hours and that would have been solid. Wade exhaled, the weight of that realization settling in quietly. Not as fear, not as relief, just understanding. He checked the inner gate, making sure it could open manually, then worked it free with careful movements. One of the horses stepped forward, hesitant, testing the space. The others followed, slow and uncertain, but willing. No rush, no chaos, just movement returning where it had been held too long. Wade guided them toward the outer yard, using his body more than his voice, the way he had done for decades. Before machines took over the work, the rhythm came back to him without effort: position, pressure, release. Simple things, forgotten things. By the time the last horse stepped into the open air, the sky had begun to lighten just slightly at the edges, the first hint of morning pressing against the horizon. Wade stood in the doorway of the barn, the cold biting less now that he had something to measure it against. Behind him the broken latch hung loose. In front of him the horses settled into the yard, their breath rising in slow, steady clouds. He turned his head toward the lower pasture. Juniper stood where he had left her. Not closer, not farther, just there, watching. Wade rested one hand against the barn door, the rough wood grounding him in the moment. The night had not been loud. There had been no sudden disaster, no crashing collapse, no desperate race against time, only a series of small failures. And one thing that had not failed at all. He stepped away from the barn and started back toward the fence. This time he did not hesitate. Frost had begun to settle along the fence wires by the time Wade reached the lower pasture again, each strand catching the faint gray of approaching dawn. The cold no longer felt sharp. It felt steady, like something that had always been there, waiting for him to notice. Juniper had not moved far. She stood just inside the line where the ground dipped, her weight resting unevenly on her front legs, her breath slow and measured. When Wade came closer this time, she did not turn away. She didn't step forward either. She simply remained. Wade stopped a few feet from the gate. For a moment, neither of them moved. The ranch behind him lay quiet again, no longer dark in the same way, but not yet awake. The kind of silence that comes after something has already happened, when the land itself seems to settle back into place. "You knew," Wade said, though his voice held no accusation. Juniper flicked one ear. It wasn't an answer. It didn't need to be. Wade rested his gloved hand against the top rail. The metal was colder than before, or maybe he was just more aware of it now. He looked at the worn wood of the post, the faint marks where hooves had struck it over time. Not just tonight, not just years ago. Repeated, learned, remembered. He let out a breath, watching it fade into the morning air. "I didn't forget how you worked," he said quietly. "I just stopped paying attention." The words felt heavier than anything he had carried out of the barn. Juniper shifted her stance slightly, the movement small but deliberate. Her body bore the signs of years, muscles softened, joints stiffened, coat roughened by seasons that had passed without much care. But there was no panic in her, no demand, only presence. Wade unlatched the gate and stepped through. The ground beyond felt different underfoot, less traveled, less shaped by routine. Grass bent in uneven patches, untouched by the daily movement of boots or tires. He hadn't stood here in a long time, not like this. Up close, Juniper's size surprised him again, not because she had changed, but because he had stopped measuring her against himself. Her head lowered slightly as he approached, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Wade raised his hand, hesitating just before it reached her neck. It wasn't fear that stopped him. It was the gap, years of it. He let his hand rest there anyway. The warmth beneath her coat came through slowly, seeping into his palm. Juniper didn't flinch. She didn't lean into the touch either. She accepted it the way she had always accepted things, without expectation. Wade swallowed, his throat tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "You kept it," he said, "all that time." His hand moved slightly, brushing along the coarse line of her mane. The gesture felt unfamiliar, not because he didn't know how to do it, but because he had not done it in so long. The motion carried memory with it: early mornings, long rides, quiet evenings when the work was done and the land finally rested. He had not lost those things. He had set them aside. Behind him, a low sound drifted from the yard, the rescued horses settling, their hooves shifting against the frozen ground, their breath steady now that the space around them had opened again. Wade listened without turning. That, too, had been his responsibility. Not just the system, not just the structure, all of it. "I built this place to run without mistakes," he said, more to himself than to her. "Made everything tighter, cleaner. Thought it meant less could go wrong." Juniper's ear angled slightly toward him. Wade let out a quiet breath. Turns out, I just stopped being part of it. The realization didn't arrive as a sudden blow. It settled slowly, the way frost formed along the fence, layer by layer, until it covered everything he thought he understood. He looked out over the pasture, the faint light revealing the lines of the land again, the slope, the fence, the distant barn where he had just come from, all of it still there, but not untouched. Wade stepped back slightly, his hand lingering on Juniper's neck for a second longer before falling away. She lifted her head a fraction, watching him, not questioning, not asking. That was the part that stayed with him the most. There had been no demand in her actions, no urgency beyond the rhythm she had learned long ago. She had not forced him to follow, had not broken the gate, had not tried to reach the barn herself. She had done what she knew, and waited. Wade nodded once, the motion small, almost instinctive. "I hear you," he said. The words felt strange, but not wrong. He turned then, looking back toward the ranch. The sky had begun to pale, stretching thin light across the horizon. Shapes returned, fences, roofs, the outline of the truck near the house. The place looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Wade stepped through the gate and pulled it closed behind him, his movements slower now, more deliberate. He checked the latch by hand, making sure it held, not because he didn't trust it, but because he needed to. When he looked back again, Juniper had already shifted her weight, settling into stillness once more. Not retreating, not advancing, just present. Wade stood there for a moment longer, then turned fully toward the ranch. There was work to do, but it wasn't the kind he had been doing all these years. As he walked back across the yard, the first thin line of sunlight broke over the hills, catching on the frost and turning it briefly to gold. Wade didn't miss it this time. The ranch did not change all at once. Morning came, as it always did, cold air thinning under the sun, frost lifting slowly from the ground, the distant hills revealing themselves in soft layers of brown and pale green. The fences stood where they had always stood. The barns held their shape. The routines, at least on the surface, remained intact. But Wade moved differently within them. He left the truck where it was more often now, its tires settling into the same patch of dirt for days at a time. When he crossed the yard, he did it on foot, his pace unhurried, his attention no longer fixed only on what needed fixing. He noticed small things again, the uneven dip in the ground near the lower fence, the way the wind shifted before dusk, the faint tracks pressed into the earth overnight. He noticed her. Juniper stayed in the far pasture, but the distance between them no longer held the same meaning. Wade walked out to her each morning, not with purpose, not with a task waiting at the end of the path, but simply because the space between them no longer felt right, left untraveled. The first few days he said nothing. He stood beside her, letting the quiet stretch without filling it. His hands found familiar motions, checking the line of her back, brushing dust from her coat, running his fingers through the rough strands of her mane. The movements came back slower than they once had, but they came back. Juniper accepted them without change. She did not lean into him. She did not step away. She remained what she had always been, steady, present, unburdened by the years Wade had spent elsewhere. Luis watched it happen from a distance at first, leaning against the fence near the barn, arms folded across his chest. He didn't comment. There was nothing to say that wouldn't disturb the shape of what was settling into place. Mara noticed sooner. "You've been out there every morning," she said one afternoon, standing in the doorway as Wade came in, his boots dusted with dry grass. Wade shrugged off his coat, hanging it carefully on the peg. "Doesn't take long." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Not pushing, not questioning, just seeing. That was enough. The rescued horses were moved within a few days, transported to a larger facility where they could be handled properly. The broken latch on the hay barn was replaced. This time, with a manual override, Wade insisted on testing himself. He ran his hand over the mechanism more than once, not trusting it in the same way he had before, not trusting himself either. Winter stretched on, but it softened at the edges. The harshest nights passed, leaving behind a quieter cold that no longer pressed quite as hard against the land. The pasture began to show small changes. patches where the grass lifted, places where the ground gave slightly underfoot instead of holding firm. Juniper moved less. Her steps shortened, her weight shifting more carefully between her legs. Some mornings Wade found her already standing near the fence when he arrived. Other days she remained where she was, watching him cross the field without turning to meet him. He adjusted without thinking. If she did not come closer, he closed the distance himself. One afternoon, as the light dipped low and stretched long shadows across the pasture, Wade brought a brush out with him. He worked it slowly along her side, the motion steady, unhurried. Dust lifted into the air in soft clouds, catching the sunlight before settling back to the ground. "You carried me longer than I realized," he said, his voice quiet against the wind. Juniper's ear flicked once. The brush paused in his hand. "I should have seen it sooner." There was no answer, no sign that the words mattered to her in the way they mattered to him. But Wade didn't expect one anymore. That wasn't the point. The days passed like that, simple, unmarked, each one folding into the next without urgency. The ranch continued to run. Fences were repaired, feed was measured, work was done, but something had shifted in the way Wade stood within it. He was no longer apart from it. Whoa! Late in the season, when the air began to carry a hint of warmth again, Wade found Juniper lying down near the edge of the pasture, her body angled toward the open land beyond the fence. The grass around her moved gently in the wind, bending and rising in slow waves. He approached quietly, his steps careful over the uneven ground. Juniper did not rise. Her breathing was slow, even, the rise and fall of her chest barely visible beneath her coat. Her eyes were half-lidded, not clouded with distress, but softened in a way that spoke of something nearing its end. Wade lowered himself beside her, the effort of it heavier than it used to be. He rested one hand along her neck, feeling the warmth still there, the life that had carried through years without asking anything in return. "I'm here," he said. The words were simple, they were enough. The wind moved through the pasture, lifting the edge of Juniper's mane, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant earth across the land. Wade sat with her as the light shifted, as the sky deepened, as the world around them continued on without interruption. There was no moment of finality he could point to, no clear line where one thing ended and another began, only stillness and presence. When the sun dipped low enough to cast the pasture in shadow, Wade remained where he was, his hand resting lightly against her, his gaze fixed not on what was leaving, but on what had remained all along. The ranch stretched out before him, unchanged in its shape, but not in its meaning. Juniper's story reminds us that loyalty does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits beyond the fence, patient and unseen, until we are finally ready to notice. Old horses, like old promises, deserve more than care. They deserve presence. Stay with us for more quiet stories where horses teach people what time, loss, and love truly mean.
If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts and subscribe to Lion's Quiet Stories for more.